Thanks for having me. Really always happy to help build and expand the consciousness hacking community. A big fan of Mikey's. He spent some time here in Hong Kong. I actually gave the first consciousness hacking talk in Amsterdam as well too, a couple of years ago. So really happy to be helping to spread the seeds. And what I'd like to do for your inaugural talk is to provide a little bit of framework. Jan mentioned a little bit of kind of confusion a little bit, and there's a lot of times where, and even Edric as well too, of looking at kind of technology. You know, certain people say certain things, and then there's the religious side, and then there's the new age group, and it can get kind of confusing. And so what I'd like to do today is provide some of the work that we've been doing, at least to try to come up with a framework so that the different groups of people can come together and really, rather than spending time arguing and mixing semantics, really working towards working together and collaborating. And so if you think about what is consciousness, the scientists say one thing, the Buddhists say another, the Christians say yet another, and then there's the masses as well. Just the last couple days, I'm actually with a group that I was invited to participate. There's a platform called AltSpace VR, which I've spent the last 3 days in. And they're actually, because Burning Man is canceled, there's a big group that's building Burning Man in AltSpace VR. And they've got kind of the playa and the man, and they've got quite a bit. They've spent 5 months building it so far. But in it, the last couple days, I was in with a bunch of Christian fundamentalists. And I was in with, there's another group called Evolve VR, EVOL, and then VR, that have space. It was amazing. They had the planet Earth with the Milky Way in the background, suspended in space, listening to an Eckhart Tolle talk and doing meditations together in VR, which is really wonderful. And the Christian fundamentalists ended up, there was a long discussion after it, and we're talking about Jesus and the armor of the shoes of peace and the different pieces of armor that you're supposed to have to prevent Satan or the devil from intruding. So the terminology and the language that people use is very different, and the way that they frame things is also very different. So how can we come together to work together, you know, as a collective? And so my background, actually, I have a degree in electrical engineering, computer science, and I've been in digital entertainment for about 30 years. The last 15 years have been in the area of consciousness. And there's a bit of a story around that. But the main framing that I have related to this is kind of from a Western scientific perspective, and looking at mind and body kind of like hardware and software in a computer. And so physically, I'm actually in my son's room here in Hong Kong, and then you're all in Singapore somewhere, I imagine, or other places around the world. But our physical bodies seem to be somewhere, and in this conversation, we seem to be somewhere as well. And so the question is, what's the relationship between this mental space where we're at in this conversation, and you seeing me on your screen, and the physical body? And so arguably where we're at right now in this conversation, or this talk that I'm giving you, is the same place you're at when you read a book, watch a movie, or play a video game. Things happen. You know, right now I'm sitting in my son's room uttering some words. These words are getting digitized by my computer. They're being sent across the internet, and they're being played on your speakers that are hitting your ears. Your eardrums are processing that, and you're processing it from the language centers. And then somehow what I'm saying is being interpreted based upon all of your past experiences, and then you're processing that, and some of you hopefully understand what I'm saying right now. And so what's happening in this process, and what's the relationship between this mental space and the physical body? And arguably there is a relationship. If you go out drinking all night, your phenomenological experience of the moment and the way that you process the moment will be very different. If you take a hit of 5-MeO-DMT or ayahuasca or LSD, your experience of the moment will change as well too. And so there's a relationship between kind of the physical material world and the subjective world of your experience of the moment. What that relationship is, actually nobody knows. that's the hard problem of consciousness. And if you're interested in digging into that very deeply, there's the work of David Chalmers who coined that term, the hard problem of consciousness. How do biological or chemical, or is it at the quantum level, things that are happening create the sensation of this? And so how does that work? We actually don't know, and I'm just being quite honest with that. But it seems like from the lived experience, there is a relationship. And as Edric was mentioning, you can measure brain waves now with EEG, et cetera. There are certain things that seem to correlate. And so we'll just leave it at that. Now, from this hardware, software perspective, and the way that I look at things is from the perspective of your awareness. And also from the perspective of every cell in your body, all there is to everything in the universe at any one moment is just what's physically around you. There's how your body feels, whether you're hungry, thirsty, or have to go to the bathroom. And there's what you know from thought in this mental space. So this talk and this conversation of stuff is happening kind of in this mental space. But here, sitting in my room, I seem to be holding a bottle here. And this appears to be a bottle to me, although from your perspective, it may be an image of the bottle. And does this bottle exist? I'd say yes, it does exist. And I ask, how do I know that it exists? Because I can see it, I can feel it, I can kind of smell it. And so I know of its existence from my experience of the moment through the senses. Now, if I ask all of you right now, does Europe exist? Does Europe exist right now? Some of you are nodding your heads. And then the question is, how do you know that Europe exists right now? There's nothing here to inform me that Europe exists. But my understanding of Europe seems to be coming from this mental. There's how my body feels, and there's what I know from thought in kind of this mental space. And from the perspective of my awareness, and actually if you look at every cell in my body, the only thing that's influencing it is what's physically around. There's the internal processes, and there's what the conceptual mind, or whatever the sense that has agency, appears to have agency, is doing. And so the problem in the big situation is that our thought and our experience of the moment through the senses uses the same hardware. It uses the same endocrine system, which regulate your hormones, and it uses the same autonomic nervous system, which is your fight or flight response. But the issue is your awareness doesn't know the difference. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But from this, then the question is, how is it that a baby is born? And so the image on on the left is of my daughter when she was first born. And at that point, this mental space for her is completely empty, it seems. And how does, through the experience of life, they then develop a mental worldview that influences how they feel and their emotions, etc. And they end up with someone to become someone on the right. And that person on the right is actually my wife, who, if I don't put the toilet seat back down after I go to the bathroom, gets really, really upset. And so how is it that a baby can go from not caring at all to getting really upset if certain things aren't done a certain way? And so what is that process of developing the programming, if you will, of the physiology and behavior? And so arguably, when we're born with instincts. And those of you that have children know that you put a nipple, they'll start suckling. If you touch their fingers, their hands, they'll clasp up. If you throw them in water, they'll actually do the right thing. And then as they experience life, they develop the intellect. And then for those of you in Singapore know that you go through this strict regimen, you do your military service, and then you develop the discipline and you develop the intellect. And then society is pretty good at getting us there, but then how do we move towards intuition and insight, a form of knowing without knowing how you know? And so the title of this talk is Personal Development, Mental Health, and Human Potential. And arguably intuition and insight and the things beyond that are in the realm of human potential. And so the premise of this is that the only difference that exists between people is that we're just kind of at different stages of development. And I want to walk through kind of a framework and a model of this developmental process. And I'm going to start in a very basic, from a very basic point. And so the point that I want to start it is at sometime between conception and birth. So there's a period, I don't know if you guys remember, but for most of you, I think your father was making love with your mother, and then an experience happened, and 300 million sperm were released, and then one of those sperm hit the egg, and then that egg then started developing. And sometime between that process, that time, and birth, you became aware. Something within you became aware. And I'm using this dot to represent this thing that became aware. And then from that awareness, you became aware that you had a body. And then from that, you actually became aware that there were surroundings. And then from that, you realize that in your surroundings, there are different objects, and these objects have relationships. And then from objects that are in your field of awareness and the relationships, you develop symbolic consciousness. You develop this kind of mental realm where we're at in this conversation. So arguably when you were born, this was clear. And this may be a little crazy already, but wherever you go, all there is in any one moment is just what's physically around you. There's how your body feels, and there's what you know in this mental realm, which is based upon all of your past experiences. And that's true wherever you go. Like right now, one level of me knows that I'm just speaking to my computer in my son's room. But the idea that you guys are actually other people that are all around the world, they're mostly in Singapore, that's all a framing I have in my mind. And my understanding and experience of that is very different from my understanding and experience of this bottle that I'm hitting against my head. And are we okay so far? Yeah? Okay. I'm just checking in. And so a large time, like if we think about arguments, conflicts, where are arguments and conflicts happening? Are they happening here? Or are they happening here? If I bring myself here in my son's room, right here and right now, everything's fine, right? And so where are the things that want to do something? Where are the things that are upset, frustrated, angry, desperate, oh, what's going to happen? Oh, China, Hong Kong. Oh, someone just showed up behind Jan. Who was that? Jan, was that a ghost? All of these things that are happening. What's happening there? All of that is things that are here projecting, influencing how I feel. But the point of this, when you were born, and I have 4 kids, I've seen this 4 times, I've been through it myself, is that when you're born, there is no symbolic consciousness, right? And so I'm going to go through 5 stages. And the game that everyone is playing, all of us right now would argue, the game that everyone's playing is what's showing up in thought, how does your body feel, and how are things playing out in space and time. That's the game that everyone's playing, irrespective of what your worldview is, right? There are thoughts and ideas. Some of you may be thinking, hey, Gino, you're full of shit right now. What about this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's great, and that's coming from thought. And then there's how you're breathing, what's going on in your body, how you're breathing, how you're feeling, et cetera. And then there are things like, oh, wow, I didn't know my son had a ship and a bulb. Ding. And so there's what's kind of physically around us, okay? And so right now, the 5-stage development process is really looking at the development of the physiology in relation to the psychology. And for those of you that are interested in people like Wilhelm Reich, who was a student of Sigmund Freud's, there's been a lot of work of really looking at the development process. And on the development side as well, there's people like Jean Piaget looking at developmental psychology, or Claire Graves, and then later on, Don Beck and Ken Wilber, who are coming up with models of building models of what reality is and what your worldview is. And so stage one, what happens is the premise is that when you're born, there is no symbolic consciousness, and experiences in space and time bind symbols and thought to processes in physiology. So initially, I experience this. I don't know what any of this is. I have certain sensations. I start correlating the sensations. Oh, I feel this, I feel this, I feel this. Oh, they call that a wee-wee. I feel this. And then this feels different. And then there's a smell. Oh, that's a poo-poo. There's a breast, milk, mother, father. And I start building a mental worldview. So consciousness initially becomes aware of itself, becomes aware of physiology, has experience, and experience binds symbols and thought to processes in physiology. So just like they say there was nothing, and there was a big bang, and there was hydrogen becoming galaxies, consciousness becoming aware of itself, and as you experience the world, you build a mental worldview, and all of these symbols here that are happening in the worldview are developed through your connection to the body, to the physiology. And so in stage one, what happens is your parents lay their conditioning on you, the education system lay their conditioning on you, especially in Singapore, and society lay their conditioning on you, and you buy into consensus reality, but you're fragmented. And so here I have the idea here, visually, think of an egg yolk turning into a chip within an egg. And so I have another diagram there that shows me in the center and the different things that drive me. So my family, my research in consciousness, I teach at a university. And these are things in thought that influence how I feel because they have some kind of meaning to me. And a large part in stage one is what happens is you kind of juggle. Your parents lay a certain process on you. You decide, why do you eat chocolate ice cream? Why do you do all these different things? Is my parents lay a process on me, and then my ego kind of keeps me locked into a pattern of behavior, and I'm doing this not because it's right or wrong, because it feels familiar. And so there's the conscious, and then there's all the suppressed stuff that's trying to work that through as well too. And I'm generally moving towards higher energy states. And so things happen around, the physiology develops through the physiology, and I start building symbolic consciousness. And then what I continue to do is expand my worldview. So the physiology develops and moves to higher energy states, and then my worldview expands. And what do I mean? And so what happens is the symbols here and relationships in the mind become coupled to emotions and feelings, which are physiological processes in the body. And so the neat thing about framing things in this way is that from your perspective, for those of you that are just meeting me for the first time, I'm just some symbol that's showing up in your field of awareness. I'm literally just showing up on your screen. And so the neat thing is whether it's a real person, whether it's a character in a movie or a character in a video game, it's something that's showing up in your field of awareness that makes you feel a certain way based upon its relationships. And so why is it you cry in a movie? Why do you feel terror and all of this? Because it's regulating your affect based upon the symbols that you see. And from your awareness, me right now to you, and someone that you're seeing in a movie or a video game, there's no difference physically, I would argue. And so whether it's the real world or a digitally constructed world, I have some worldview, I'm acting on it, and I can see some questions that are coming up, in the chat. And so there are some things that are being stimulated, and then there's a response that wants to come out, and because I want to expand my knowledge because I want to know. And it's triggered some things that have perked my curiosity. And so I continue to develop this, and my energy system continues to grow. And I buy into consensus reality. And for this, I'm fragmented. And so for me, maybe I'll do my work. Oh, I got laid off. Oh, I'll go home. hug my daughter or make love to my wife or girlfriend or something. And so I'm doing all these behaviors. Oh, that's not working out. Maybe I'll go eat a tub of Ben and Jerry's or something. And I'm just doing this to regulate my physiology to maintain some kind of homeostasis. And so I'm fragmented. So I have these different parts of me. Oh, I'll just get another job. I'll just do this, etc. And these are just different shards that are fragmented, but they use the same underlying physiological processes. And so I look at it as physiological processes in this diagram and such. If you know anything about Jungian psychology, they look at it as the unconscious, subconscious, and the ego, right? And the conscious. And so there's the anima, animus, the persona, personae, there's the shadow, and there's the self, and there's a projection into the world. And that's how the ego knows what's happening. And then I wear a mask, and then there's society. What will the neighbors think? There's law, there's nature, and then there's the transcendent mystery source from which all things arise. And so this image is lifted straight. There's a wonderful documentary series called A Psyche and Symbol. This is from Joseph Campbell, but this is a good summary of kind of Jungian psychology. Now, the point that I have is that whether something's happening physically or it's happening mentally, it's using the same hardware, but your awareness doesn't know the difference. So if someone came and tried to kill me right now, I should feel fear, and my body is responding. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, my body's responding, and it's triggering my fight or flight response. So my hippocampus shunts, my amygdala goes off, and my body prepares to either kick their ass, run away, or freeze. And that's the classic fight or flight response. But if I say, hey, your stock portfolio just went to zero, or your CFO just took all the money and moved to the Bahamas, it's a similar physiological response, but there's nothing physically threatening you. And so the point is that the things that happen in this mental realm and the things that happen physically around us use the same hardware. They use the same underlying physiological processes, but our awareness doesn't know the difference. And so here, there's the dopamine, there's the autonomic nervous system and the vagal nerve. And so these are the kind of underlying implementation mechanisms of what's going on in the body for this. And again, so if I know the difference between the influence here, and if I can let go of this, the stimuli coming from here, and if I can stay grounded here, knowing that I'm just in my son's room, why would there be an argument? Where is conflict coming from? Arguably, it's coming from an emotional attachment to some mental worldview, clashing against an emotional attachment to some other worldview. And we can get into that. And so behavior and what drives me is I'm trying to maintain kind of allostasis. I'm trying to keep my physiology in what feels familiar, generally moving to higher energy states. And what I mean by that is the peak performance flow state. And so, hey, why do people go surfing? Why do they go skiing? Why do they, I've got a great job. Why do I want a better one? I've got a great wife. Why would I want a better one? It's because the physiology is moving to higher energy states, and I just want to experience new things, but I'm driven by the peak performance flow state. It's the context that kicks me into the state. But the big thing here is that the energy and the state relates to how you're breathing and how you're holding your physiology. And so there's a step towards, I'm jumping ahead of myself, but can you then cultivate greater interoceptive awareness and be able to self-regulate independent of the stories? And so, but generally speaking, in this stage is, hey, this is exciting. This is, I really want to do this. And that's what drives me. And so here, there's a model here. This is the Claire Graves looking at development. And so Jean Piaget, those of you that have kids know that you have to walk before you run. And then there are certain ages where language facilities develop. And Piaget kind of mapped out till the age of 18 or so with his kids. And then Claire Graves looked at the development of people beyond that. And so arguably the decisions you make today are very different from the decisions you would have made 5 or 10 years ago. And that's true for individuals, and it's also true for countries, right? And so if you look at Singapore, actually Singapore is here, kind of authoritarian. And then I guess Hong Kong's moving in that direction. Recent politics. And so kind of there's a spectrum. And if you look at things in this way, if you look at the United States now, and if you look at China, China is kind of where the US was at the turn of the century between the 1800s and 1900s. You know, if you think of the way things were, they had child labor there, they were working in the coal mines and all this, et cetera. If you look at human rights and even women, you know, so there was kind of a, that's kind of, China is kind of where the US was during the height of their industrial revolution. If you look at Saudi Arabia is kind of where the US was in the 1600s. So if you think of the Puritans and the witch trials, et cetera. And so as an individual develops, you know, they kind of develop and shift their worldview. In a similar way, as a collection of people develop, they move forward as well too. So generally, and if we look at recent politics, it could be 1 step forward, 2 steps back. But generally speaking, there's a move forward. And so with this right now, and looking at the modern world, and what stage 1 is about, is how do we get people to where modern consensus reality was? And if we think of the origins of this mental realm, there's a guy named Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who coined this mental space that we're in as the noosphere. There was first the geosphere, then there was the biosphere, and then there was this noosphere, which is where we're at right now too. And he postulated this thing called kind of omega point, where, you know, rather than the technological singularity, it's a process of mass collective awakening. And if you're in this room, you're in that team, whether you know it or not. And so if we look at this, the origin of the noosphere, this mental realm, I'd like for you to think about, just as a thought experiment, imagine the first person that became self-aware, or in simple terms, biblical Adam. So before eating from the fruit of knowledge, Adam, or the first person, think of the 2001, you know, before they threw that bone up into space, you know, we're just kind of doing what we do, you know, acting from our kind of innate behavior. But then after biting from the fruit of knowledge, and the first person that becomes self-aware, the noosphere was just their experience of reality. It was just them and their experience. And they had no notion of buildings or anything. It was just them in nature. And their objective was to avoid the predators, find shelter, find food, and they had to navigate through the nature, the biosphere. And so what happened is they observed nature, and the ancient Greeks were very careful to distinguish between physis and things that have gone through the filter of the mind, techne. And so they experience nature, and they develop a representation for it, or an idea of it. And then once they have an idea in this mental realm, they can communicate that idea to another person. And then once they both have that idea, they can also create things. And so the ancient Greeks were very careful to distinguish between things that happen in physis, things that happen in nature, and techne, that have gone through the filter of the mind. So the ancient Greeks would say, if a star in the heavens went supernova, they would say, that's physis. Nobody ever touched that star. It's acting of its true nature. But if you look at everything around you right now, if you're in a room, just take a look at everything that's around you right now. Everything here came from somebody's mind, right? And so if you think about this, the material world, and so there's since Adam to today, the collection of everyone that's ever existed and every intention that they've had projected into physis, into the material world, is our world today. The material world is just the collective intention of everyone that's ever existed in nature. And that accounts for everything. you guys still with me, or have I lost people yet? Okay, great. Okay, and so if you think about it, the material world is kind of like Minecraft, right? Who built this? You know, for you guys in Singapore, there was this family that did pretty well. They're still president, you know, and their ideas have influence, and it seemed to have worked. And all the rules, all the laws, and everything that's happened, all the laws that we have, and all the physical structures came from people before us. So those of you that are familiar with the game Minecraft, we're just in this Minecraft world that is designed by nature, Fusus, God, etc., and the collective intention of everyone that's ever existed. Yeah? Does this make sense so far? Okay, great. And so the challenge is that for each person that's born, when you're first born, you're just like biblical Adam. And the objective that you have is to get to where consensus reality is. You have to go to the edge of what everybody understands in order for you kind of to develop. Yeah? And so our education system and a PhD is just getting to the edge and then adding a little bit of knowledge, right? But there's a process of getting to the edge and then creating something new. And so you have to leave the realm of consensus reality. You have to go into the unknown, discover the fire, and bring it back. And that realization is stage 2. And so stage 2 of what happens is you look at consensus reality, and pardon the language, is people look at consensus reality and say, hey, fuck this shit. I'm going all in on one thing. It's like, hey, this environment, the way we're living, is not sustainable. Or, hey, women shouldn't be treated that way. It's not sustainable. Or, hey, what's all this plastic doing in the ocean? Someone's got to do something about it, and it's not sustainable. So they just take one of these things, and they go all in on one thing. And when they do that, these different fragments of them consolidate into one, and their whole endocrine system and autonomic nervous system become coupled to their perception of this one thing. So I'm thinking about this nonstop, and I'm meeting this person and everything, and okay, we're gonna do this, let's do this together. And then what happens is there's a coupling of the nervous system and all the physiological processes on this one worldview that I'm going all in on. And so what happens is these different fragments consolidate, and I'm all in on one thing. And I have to do this because my ego generally keeps me locked. And so some of you are like, hey, I really want to do this, but then, oh no, something else came up, and you kind of go back down. And so your subconscious kind of keeps your ego kind of locked in homeostasis. And what has to happen is you have to pop through that. You have to be focused, disciplined, and I'm all in on one thing. And so here, the metaphor, think of an egg turning into a chick inside the egg. And you just have to keep pecking at one point. And as long as you keep pecking on one point, the egg is going to crack. And what happens is when you're high energy, focused, and you're open, surreal shit starts happening. Coincidences, synchronicities, all these things start happening, and you realize, my God, there are bigger forces at work. Right? And then, for Edric, the playa provides. How is this happening? What's going on here? How is it that, what, you're here too? How is this happening? And you realize that, what are the chances of this? And then that creates the crack, and you realize that there are bigger forces at work. Now, what happens here, and this is the challenge, is you have to shift so in stage 1 and stage 2, you're driven by subtle and not so subtle forms of fear, need, and desire. And what has to happen is when you realize that there are bigger forces at work, you have to let go of the motivations driven by the fears, needs, and desires. And you have to shift your energy source from those fears, needs, and desires to joy, gratitude, and wonder, which somatically feel very different. Now, the problem with this is that for people that go all in on this, is your whole reality and your whole energy system is tied to your perception of this one thing, and it gives you the reason for existing. Now what happens is surreal shit happens. You're going to try to figure that surreal shit out. And then even more surreal shit happens, and you're going to try to figure that out. And then what happens for a lot of people is you end up in a positive feedback loop. And then pretty soon is you're not eating right, you're not sleeping right, and then the physiology cannot maintain this energy. And then there's a collapse, which is called the dark night of the soul. Now, the reason why is my energy system is tied to my belief system, and I'm passionate about that, and it's given me all of these deep insights. And what has to happen is when I realize that there are bigger forces at work, I have to let that go. And that's challenging because my whole existence is tied to this mission in my life. And to decouple it is effectively psychological suicide. And the reason why it's difficult is because all of these symbols and these beliefs use the same physiological mechanisms that are keeping your body physically alive. But the issue is your awareness doesn't know the difference. It doesn't know the difference between the stimuli coming from here versus what's coming from here. Now, generally speaking, the way to do this is underneath all of the stories of the conditioned belief system that you have, underneath all of the stories, there's an inner experience that's present within everybody. And the only way I can describe this experience with words is that right here and right now, it's good to be alive. Now, if you can feel that, joy, wonder, gratitude, compassion, everything comes from that. And if you really feel into it, compared to being dead right now, this is fucking amazing. And so there's a vast reservoir of energy that you can connect to that doesn't require you to do anything. Now, to decouple from the symbols, though, is effectively psychological suicide. And when you start yanking on this, it's going to start yanking on your emotional energy system because of all of the conditioning that's been baked in through your life to this moment. And to fully decouple is terrifying. It's literally like jumping off the roof of a building. And so what has to happen is you have to reconnect to the innate joy of being. And the only thing that will save you through this process is knowing the difference between what's coming from here versus what's coming from thought. And when you fully decouple from everything, then the only thing that's left is what's physically around you and how your body feels, which is what it was like when you were a baby. And in Christian terms, that's what it means to be reborn. And in Buddhist terms, that's Buddha underneath the tree, right? So if you know the Buddhist story, actually, many of you probably do. Siddhartha, I'm going to try to figure out how to end suffering. I go stay with all the ascetics and everything. That's not it. That's not it. It's like, to hell with it. I'm just going to sit underneath this tree and I'm going to figure this shit out on my own. So he sits there. Mara shows up, the daughters of Mara, all of his desires. Hey, oh, wow, she's really beautiful and everything. And Siddhartha's still sitting there. And hey, if you get up now, you could be president of the United States. You can imagine Donald Trump going, okay. But Siddhartha is just still kind of sitting there. And then all these fears, these soldiers shoot arrows, they turn into flowers, all these demons, he's still sitting there. Then finally Mara shows up and says, who's here to witness your enlightenment? And then he says, the earth is here to witness my enlightenment because I know the difference between this and what's coming from thought. And if you can fully decouple, then, and what happened when you were a baby is things happen here through the physiology and you start building this mental worldview. Now, for most people, it's my thoughts and my beliefs acting through physiology. I engage the material world. Reality responds, which influences how I feel and how I think. So I'm doing this, expanding my knowledge, moving to higher energy states. When I fully decouple, it's back to this. So living from presence. I'm grounded, I'm centered. I know how to self-regulate. I can be still. And as things happen, things show up in thought. Hey, Shane asks, hey, can you give a talk on Saturday? Sure. And so things just show up, and then you try them out. And it's like throwing darts against a dartboard. And so this stage 4 process is a process, oh, this is the decoupling process. This is decoupling the influences of the symbols on the processes of physiology. And this is the process of stage 4 of refining intuition. This is the mystical path. You're there, something shows up. Hey, I get this idea that I should do this. And then you try it out, and then it either happens or it doesn't. And so this is a process of refining intuition. This is the mystical path, and it's moving towards living from presence versus like a belief or a conviction of something. And then stage 5 are special abilities. And so this is the human potential side. And the mental disorder, the mental health issue is the stage, generally the stage 2 to stage 3 process, when there's high energy tied to the symbols. And generally speaking, if you can bring yourself fully present right here and right now, and again, just sitting in my son's room on a Saturday afternoon, everything is fine, and the natural state is joy. Now, some people are born with special abilities, but then they become suppressed. You know, they talk about indigo kids, etc. Some people, when they pop from stage 2 to stage 3, or they do heavy psychedelics or something, they develop special abilities. But the issue is their energy system isn't stable, and they haven't let go of the influences of the symbols. So they're not full, you know, it's a sporadic kind of a thing. But if you fully decoupled, you can self-regulate, and so real shit can happen and it doesn't phase you at all. You can actually develop special abilities in a grounded kind of way. And so that's kind of the 5-stage model. Here's a quick summary with some images. The awakening is, I didn't get across, is at some point the bird has to jump off the limb of the tree, you know, from the nest, and trust that the wings will work. And then there's a refining intuition and in human potential. And then there are some processes around this, and you can kind of tell where people are at. And then, okay, there's a bunch of questions. Now, where things are at with this trans-text stuff is that 5,000 years ago, your understanding of reality was dictated by where you lived and what the religious tradition was. And what happened was, since Aristotle, there's been a split. There's the material domain, which is science, and then there's this mental domain, which is kind of religion and culture. Now, the exciting thing that Edric was pointing to is that now, with interactive media, real-time biometrics, and big data, you can actually, in quantified self, etc., is I can create a stimuli with a video game or VR. I can see the conscious decisions you make, and I can see how your physiology responds. And then based upon that, I can start mapping out what your belief system is. And I can create personalized experiences to help facilitate that transformation. And so this is kind of an exciting area in the trans-tech space. Now for me, a little bit different is this COVID time has afforded me some time to reflect and look at society at large. And right now, my main interest is in building systems that modern society doesn't do very well. And so I have a couple projects. The first one I won't talk about. Basically, we're building applications in a one-on-one kind of way. It's an Uber for mindfulness, and that's all I'll say about that. The second is I also run a workshop all around the world called Entrepreneurship, Innovation, and Self-Discovery. And the tagline for that is entrepreneurship as a spiritual path. So whenever there's a passion or a desire, working through a conditioned worldview, which is your belief system, with or against the unknown, which is nature, the universe, or God, there's an opportunity for transformation. What are the stories driving the emotions? What are the emotions motivating the action? And as you do something, how does the reality respond? And as the reality responds, how does that make you feel? And it's helping people understand that loop. And what we found is that the success of a startup company or a large corporation correlates to the level of consciousness of the entrepreneur or the management team. And what I mean by their level of consciousness is their ability to maintain presence. Can you be still grounded, centered, and connected to intuition while the shit is hitting the fan all around you? if you understand this 5-stage model, an entrepreneur is basically a stage 2 person, which is important to create the new systems for future generations. If you understand this whole physis techne thing and what society is about. And so this is a very important part. And so what we do is, with Mystagogical, is I have a bunch of people that don't need money anymore. And so these are like tenured professors, people that have had exits, trust fund people. And what we do is we work with entrepreneurs in an entrepreneurship as a spiritual path. So as the entrepreneur creates their company, that's their journey. And we have a whole model for this that we developed, to nurture and support them and to build a community to support this kind of thing. And that right now, the code name for it is Mystagogical. And that could be another, I have a whole nother deck for that. Another thing that we're doing, and that's just reframing entrepreneurship, looking at it from the perspective of personal development. The next thing is called Antarabhav, which is the Sanskrit word for the bardos. And what we're trying to do with this very quickly, is set up what I call a Betty Ford clinic for people going through spiritual emergency. And so what happens with people in stage 2, when they go to stage 3, they pop. They end up, oh, I get it. I've seen unity. Oh, Jesus spoke to me. And, they'll talk to you like this and in a very high energy, energized kind of way. And then what usually happens with people is, oh, don't you get it? Come on. You guys are with me. You guys understand, right? And people perceive that to be manic. And then what happens is they talk to their family and their friends are like, hey, something's kind of wrong with Gino. He's a little off right now, don't you think? And a lot of these people end up in mental hospitals and or homeless. And so part of Antarabhav, what we're trying to do is set up a network of places around the world in nature with people that have gone through the process to help them, to midwife them through this kind of awakening, this kind of stage 2, 3 to kind of 4 process. And so that's Antarabhav. And then people that have gone through this, we actually have a collection of people around the world that have special abilities, and we have academics that are researching this and building community around that. And then we have people, generally they're in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, that have developed these gifts. And the idea is that once you have a person that's kind of gone through this process, is to help mentor them through to develop their gifts on the human potential side. And that project is a global decentralized mystery school. And so these are all systems that I see that are needed globally that modern society doesn't really know how to address very well. And I will, way over time, and I'll just end it there. And then what we're doing is really looking at, given this as a framework, how do we get people that have unique experiences to bring them together to create the safe containers for them to go from a lone wolf to becoming a wolf pack. Now the challenge is with these high stage 2 people, low stage 3 people, is they've had an experience. Like, no, I saw it. I saw the light and everything. Oh, no, it's not enlightenment. Oh, this is something different. No, it's not non-dual. No, you don't understand. It's very, very different. None of you really understand what I went through. And so the implementation of that is the nervous system. And generally, these are very capable people, but then they create these psychological walls to keep them safe. And anytime they try to do something with somebody, when things go high energy sensitive, there's going to be friction there because the implementation of that is the nervous system. And so we come up with a container that brings these people together. And so some of the things that we do with that is we do a process called the evolving caravan. Or and what we found is that when you get a bunch of people that have done a lot of inner work traveling together in the unknown, magic happens. And so what we do generally is we travel together, and in each city we have a place like a workshop that we're doing or some talks that we give, and we don't know where we're staying and we don't know how we're getting there. And the first year we did this 2 years ago, we were in London, Amsterdam, Lisbon, Paris, Munich, Davos, and Zurich in about 2.5 weeks. And what we found is it's kind of a stress test. And so we're looking at kind of these new methods of bringing these lone wolves together that allow them to use their gifts, but then not alienate and not create conflict between the people. And so those are kind of some of the things that we're working on. And then I'll stop there.